Millie Bobby Brown is the complete opposite of Eleven's quiet intensity. Everyone is aware how barely Eleven speaks in early seasons, communicating through stares and the occasional monosyllabic response while processing a childhood of trauma that left her socially awkward. Meanwhile, Millie Bobby Brown is one of the most outgoing, media-savvy young celebrities in Hollywood, delivering confident interviews since she was 12. She launches beauty brands, produced films, and navigated press tours with the polish of someone who's been doing this for decades. Fans watching her talk show appearances experience whiplash, seeing the girl who played a character raised in a lab, discussing her business ventures and cracking jokes about her co-stars. But guess what? The contrast becomes even more apparent during behind-the-scenes footage, where Brown is constantly laughing, dancing between takes, and generally being the energetic center of attention. Meanwhile, Eleven spends most scenes looking traumatized or concentrating intensely on moving objects with her mind. Brown has admitted in interviews that playing someone so internal and restrained requires conscious effort because her natural personality is basically the opposite. It's a testament to her acting abilities that she can completely suppress that natural effervescence to become a character defined by stillness and buried emotion. But Brown isn't the only cast member whose real personality would surprise their character. Finn Wolfhard is way cooler and more artistic than Mike Wheeler's nerdy sweetness. Mike is the heart of the party in Stranger Things, the most awkward and wholesome in character and in ways that feel very grounded in 1980s, small-town America. Finn Wolfhard, meanwhile, is a legitimate indie rocker who plays bass and guitar in a band called the Aubreys, has a music taste that skews toward obscure alternative artists that most adults haven't heard of, and carries himself with the casual confidence of someone who's been around creative industry professionals since he was a child. He's directed short films, dabbled in screenwriting, and generally approaches his career with an artistic sensibility that's miles away from Mike's straightforward heroism. Watching Wolfhard in interviews reveals someone who's thoughtful and somewhat reserved, but in a cool, detached way, rather than Mike's eager puppy dog passion. He discusses film theory and music production with genuine passion, while Mike's deepest intellectual pursuit is probably trying to understand Eleven's powers or planning the next campaign. The gap between character and actor is particularly noticeable in Wolfhard's fashion choices. He shows up to events in interesting vintage pieces and artistic styling that Mike Wheeler would never attempt, because Mike dresses like his mom still buys his clothes, and he hasn't noticed or cared enough to develop personal style. It's wild, right? Meanwhile, another cast member has been hiding a completely different energy. Gaten Matarazzo is nowhere near as nerdy as Dustin Henderson. Dustin is the lovable nerd who knows science facts, builds radio equipment in his spare time, and gets genuinely excited about discovering new species of interdimensional slugs in his trash can. He's the comic relief who leans into his dorkiness, wearing his thinking cap without irony, and approaching life with the enthusiasm of someone who hasn't learned to be self-conscious yet. Gaten Matarazzo is a theater kid who's performed on Broadway, has a surprisingly smooth social presence in interviews, and carries himself with the confidence of someone who's been a professional performer since childhood. He's charismatic in ways that feel practiced and polished. Matarazzo has talked about how playing Dustin requires him to dial up the nerdiness and enthusiasm to levels that don't match his actual personality, which tends toward being more laid back and self-aware than his character. He's also openly discussed his experience with cleidocranial dysplasia and how it's affected his life and career, showing a maturity and willingness to engage with serious topics that Dustin probably wouldn't have the vocabulary or life experience to articulate. It's another example of excellent casting-finding actors who can disappear into characters that don't match their natural energy. By the way, if you're a Stranger Things fan, I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe. It helps more than you know. Joe Keery is significantly more artistic and alternative than Steve Harrington's jock-turned-babysitter persona. Steve started as the stereotypical popular jock who cared about his hair, his car, and his social status before transforming into the world's best babysitter. He fights monsters with a nail bat while giving romantic advice to teenagers. He's earnest and straightforward, someone whose complexity comes from unexpected heroism rather than intellectual depth. Basically a golden retriever in human form by season 4. But hold on for Joe Keery. In reality, he has a thriving music career under the name Joe, where he writes, produces, and performs psychedelic indie pop that sounds nothing like anything Steve Harrington would listen to or understand. He's deeply engaged with vintage synthesizers and lo-fi production aesthetics that suggest someone with genuine artistic vision and technical knowledge about music creation. Keery also has an incredibly distinct personal style featuring bold colors, vintage pieces, and interesting silhouettes that look like he's channeling 1970s rock stars. In interviews, Keery comes across as thoughtful and slightly introverted, someone who thinks carefully before speaking and seems genuinely uncomfortable with excessive attention. The fact that Kiri can bury his actual artistic alternative personality to play someone as straightforward and masculine as Steve shows us, we are right for loving him so much as not only a character, but a person as well. And the personality gaps aren't limited to the younger cast members. Winona Ryder is far more reserved and introspective than Joyce Byers' explosive maternal energy. We've seen how Joyce, the perfect mother, spends the entire series operating at emotional level 10, constantly yelling, crying, insisting she's right when everyone thinks she's crazy, and generally existing in a state of high-stress panic that would exhaust anyone in real life. She's all raw nerve endings and maternal instinct, someone who communicates through intense eye contact and raised voices, and absolutely will not be told to calm down because her children are in danger, and she doesn't have time for anyone's uncertainty. Winona Ryder, particularly in recent years, presents as someone thoughtful and measured, speaking carefully in interviews with a quiet intensity that's nothing like Joyce's explosive volatility. She's discussed her struggles with anxiety and the pressures of early fame, showing vulnerability and self-awareness that feels very internal and controlled, compared to Joyce's external emotional storms. Ryder has also been open about how physically and emotionally exhausting it is to play Joyce, because maintaining that level of frantic energy requires tapping into places that don't match her natural temperament. It tends toward being more observant and cerebral than reactionary. She's mentioned needing recovery time after particularly intense scenes, because embodying that much panic and determination take a toll when it's not your default state. Fans who remember her from earlier roles know she's capable of playing characters across the emotional spectrum. But the contrast doesn't stop here. Her on-show boyfriend is yet to be discovered. David Harbour is nothing like Jim Hopper's explosive tough guy persona. David Harbour is far more introspective and intellectual than Jim Hopper's gruff, emotionally reactive persona. Hopper is introduced as a police chief who communicates mostly through size, yelling, and physical presence. He solves problems with force, stubborn persistence, and barely suppressed rage, carrying his grief openly in the form of alcoholism, isolation, and self-destructive behavior. Hopper feels like a man constantly on the verge of exploding, someone whose emotions live right at the surface. On the other hand, David Harbour presents as thoughtful, articulate, and deeply reflective in interviews. He speaks at length about psychology, masculinity, fame, and mental health, with a level of self-awareness that couldn't be further from Hopper's blunt communication style. Harbour has openly discussed his own struggles with bipolar disorder and depression, often framing them through careful analysis rather than emotional outbursts, which contrasts sharply with Hopper's tendency to repress until he breaks. Harbour has also described how physically demanding it is to play Hopper's constant anger and tension, noting that maintaining that level of aggression requires deliberate effort because it doesn't match his natural temperament. While Hopper externalizes pain through violence and authority, Harbour processes emotion intellectually and verbally. The gap between them highlights how controlled and intentional Harbour's performance really is, transforming introspection into raw intensity on screen. Then, there's an actor whose real-life personality might surprise fans the most. Noah Schnapp is significantly more outgoing and socially confident than Will Byers' quiet sensitivity. Will has spent 5 seasons being the party's sensitive member, the kid who's been through more trauma than anyone should survive and carries it with quiet sadness that makes him seem perpetually on the verge of tears. He's shy, introspective, artistic in ways that isolate him from peers, and struggling with sexuality and identity issues that he can barely articulate even to people who love him. Noah Schnapp, meanwhile, is extremely active on social media, posts comedic TikToks constantly, and presents as someone comfortable with attention and public performance in ways that Will absolutely isn't. Can you believe it? Schnapp has been open about his own sexuality in ways that contrast with Will's painful closeting, discussing his identity casually in videos and interviews with a confidence that comes from growing up in a more accepting era than the 1980s. Setting of the show, he's also clearly close friends with his castmates and comfortable being goofy and loud around them, which is completely different from Will's position as the group's quietest member, who often fades into the background while others take charge. The fact that Schnapp can bury his natural extroversion to play someone so internal and pained demonstrates serious acting chops, but it also means his social media presence regularly surprises fans who expect him to be more like his perpetually traumatized character. And the contrasts continue with the show's breakout supporting cast. Joseph Quinn is charming and polished in ways that Eddie Munson's chaotic metalhead energy could never be. Eddie was the perfect hero of the show who died, dramatic, D&D obsessed metalhead who lived in a trailer, dealt drugs, and cultivated an outcast persona that kept him on the margins of Hawkins society. Joseph Quinn, meanwhile, shows up to interviews and press events as this incredibly charming British actor who attended the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Art, speaks with eloquent precision, and carries himself with the polish of someone trained in classical theater. He's discussed his background in serious dramatic roles and approaches his craft with obvious intelligence and consideration that Eddie probably would have mocked as pretentious. The accent difference alone creates massive separation between actor and character. Eddie's American accent and Midwestern cadence are so convincing that many fans didn't realize Quinn was British until they saw him in interviews, at which point the cognitive dissonance nearly broke their brains. Quinn is thoughtful and measured where Eddie was impulsive and reactive, diplomatic where Eddie was confrontational, and generally seems like someone who'd get along fine in conventional society, whereas Eddie explicitly positioned himself as an outsider who didn't want to conform. Watching Quinn discuss the craft of acting in his natural accent while remembering Eddie's theatrical, "This is music," speech creates a fascinating contrast between the person and the performance, but perhaps nobody experiences more radical transformation between actor and character than one specific cast member. Sadie Sink is nowhere near as tough or aggressive as Max Mayfield's skateboarding badass persona. Max is introduced as the tough new girl who skateboards, plays arcade games better than the boys, and doesn't take anyone's attitude without firing back twice as hard. She's confident and slightly abrasive, someone who's built emotional walls after a difficult childhood and stepfamily situation. Sadie Sink, meanwhile, comes across in interviews as thoughtful, soft-spoken, and genuinely sweet in ways that feel completely disconnected from Max's prickly exterior. She discusses theater and dance with obvious passion, having come from a Broadway background before landing Stranger Things. Sink has mentioned that learning to skateboard for the role required serious practice because it didn't come naturally to her, and that accessing Max's anger and pain requires emotional preparation that doesn't reflect her actual temperament. She's close with her castmates, and seems like someone who's genuinely kind and considerate, whereas Max spends most of Season 2 being deliberately difficult before slowly warming up to the group. The biggest contrast might be that Sink seems like someone who was probably well-liked and got along with various social groups in school, but Max is explicitly an outsider who doesn't fit easily at all. Now wait for the one who is literally a man in the show, but in real life, he's a bit of an introvert. Caleb McLaughlin is far more grounded than Lucas Sinclair's reactive intensity. Lucas Sinclair is often positioned as the group's realist, but he expresses that realism through confrontation. Lucas is emotionally guarded and frequently operates in defense mode, especially in earlier seasons. His confidence comes across as tension, and his loyalty often shows itself through conflict rather than reassurance. Lucas feels like someone constantly preparing for things to go wrong. Meanwhile, Caleb McLaughlin presents as calm, reflective, and quietly self-assured in interviews. He speaks thoughtfully about his career, representation, and the responsibility that comes with growing up in the public eye, often choosing his words carefully rather than reacting emotionally. McLaughlin has discussed the pressure of being judged as he matured on screen, addressing it with maturity and perspective that feels far removed from Lucas's teenage defensiveness. McLaughlin also brings a level of emotional openness to conversations about race, identity, and industry challenges that Lucas, constrained by the setting and his age, rarely gets to articulate directly. Where Lucas expresses care through argument and intensity, McLaughlin communicates through clarity and restraint. He has spoken about how he consciously balances Lucas's impulsiveness with grounded decision-making, making the character feel believable without letting it become overwhelming. The contrast highlights McLaughlin's control as a performer. He doesn't simply react on screen, he calibrates, and that awareness allows him to embody Lucas's sharp edges without letting them define who he actually is. And the personality inversions extend to the show's villains as well. Jamie Campbell Bower is remarkably sweet and goofy compared to Vecna's apocalyptic nightmare energy. Vecna is the show's ultimate villain, a rotting, skeletal monster who feeds on trauma, snaps bones with his mind, and wants to merge dimensions while destroying humanity because he's decided people are fundamentally corrupt and dishonest. He's all dark philosophy, psychological torture, and genuine malevolence. But wait, Jamie Campbell Bower, in reality, is legitimately delightful in interviews and behind-the-scenes content, constantly joking around with cast members. He is known for doing silly voices and generally being someone who radiates positive energy that's completely opposite to the character he's playing. He's discussed how much fun he had working in the prosthetics and creating Vecna's physicality. Bower has also talked about his background in music and more sympathetic roles. The transformation he undergoes between being the friendly, warm person who shows up to set and becoming the nightmare creature who traumatizes teenagers is genuinely impressive, involving hours in makeup and a complete shift in body language and vocal performance. Fans meeting him at conventions are reportedly always surprised by how much he smiles and laughs, because it's impossible to reconcile that energy with Vecna's grim worldview and murderous intentions. So, which character is your most favorite one after knowing them truly? Drop a comment about what you think about them.